Palkhivala Foundation welcomes you all. May I now request Mr. S. Mahalingam, to Managing Trustee of the Palkhivala Foundation, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Durga. We begin this program by greeting all of you on the Independence Day. On behalf of Palkhivala Foundation, I welcome all of you to the Palkhivala Foundation lecture by Mr. Arun Maira. Since it is the 75th anniversary of our independence, he has chosen to speak on India at 100, achieving his tryst with destiny. In his famous Tryst with Destiny speech delivered at the Central Hall of Parliament, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru outlined the vision. He said, "The ambition of the greatest man of our generation has been to wipe every tear from every eye. That may be beyond us, but so long as there are tears and suffering, so long our work will not be over." Let me start by saying a few words about Mr. Palkhivala. Mr. K.V. Kamath says in his book, Nani A. Palkhivala, Alive, Mr. Palkhivala was an ardent defender of the Constitution, a champion of civil liberties, a far-sighted economic thinker, and a legendary lawyer. Mr. Palkhivala was a multifaceted individual, a great jurist. He was the most prominent lawyer of his generation, industrialist. He was on the board of Tata Sons and other companies, and he was the chairman of TCS, a company where I worked. Diplomat, he was in India's ambassador to the United States. Economist, his analysis of budget in well-attended public meetings across the country conveyed his extraordinary grasp over economics. Philosopher, his book on India's priceless heritage is a great reference book, and he had attachment to many faiths. Author, he has written a number of books. Philanthropist, and above all, a great patriot. Palkhivala Foundation has completed 19 years of existence. It was formed in February 2003, a couple of months after the demise of Mr. Palkhivala. On his passing away, a number of admirers of his at Chennai decided to create an entity which will preserve his memory by continuing to educate and serve the public, whether through lectures or through creating institutions. In 2005, the foundation promoted Nani Palkhivala Arbitration Center to facilitate institutional arbitration to render speedy and cost-effective justice for legal disputes. This is a vibrant center conducting many arbitration matters at any time. In addition, it functions as a think tank advocating reforms and practices to make arbitration a preferred tool in settling disputes effectively. The annual international conference that this center conducts in New Delhi in February each year is a well-attended event with speakers and participants from India and overseas. Palkhivala Foundation has conducted over 40 meetings so far with eminent speakers like Mr. Soli Sarabji, Mr. Y.H. Malegam, Mr. Ram Jethlani, Mr. Raghuram Rajan, Mr. S. Ramdurai, Mr. Harish Salve, Mr. Justice and Santosh Hegde, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, Mr. Justice A.P. Shah, Lord Peter Henry Goldsmith, Mr. Arun Shori, Mr. Saktikanta Das, and Mr. Ruchiv Sharma. In 2013, we had the honor of having Sri Narendra Modi, at that time Prime Minister nominee of NDA, to give a lecture under the auspices of Palkhivala Foundation. Joining this illustrious list is Mr. Arun Maira. Let me say a few words about him. He is the chairman of HelpAge International. He is a former member of Planning Commission. He is also the former chairman of Boston Consulting Group India. Discussions on policy and the future of India are enriched with Arun Maira's views, and not just because he was a member of the Planning Commission of India for 5 years till June 2014. He is one of those rare people who have held leadership positions in both the private as well as the public sector, bringing a unique perspective on how the two can work together to foster growth for India. He has led 3 rounds of participative and comprehensive scenario building for the future of India. In 1999, with the Confederation of Indian Industry, in 2005 with the World Economic Forum, and 2011 with the Planning Commission. In the first part of his career, he spent 25 years in the Tata Group at various important positions from 1965 to 1985. From 1989 to 99, Arun was in the USA with Arthur D. Little, the international management consultancy, and its subsidiary, Innovation Associates, where he advised companies across sectors and geographies on their growth strategies and handling transformational change. Arun returned to India in 2000 as the chairman of the Boston Consulting Group India, a position he held for 9 years till 2008. In 2009, Arun was appointed as the member of the Planning Commission, which is led by the Prime Minister of India. In this position, he led the development of strategies for the country on issues relating to industrialization and urbanization. He also advised the Commission on its future role. The other leadership positions he has held include the Chancellor of Central University of Himachal Pradesh, Chairman of the Foundation of MSc Culture Clusters, Chairman of Axis Bank Foundation and Save the Children India, and Chairman Quality Council of India. He was also the board member of the India Brand Equity Association, Equity Foundation, the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, and the UN Global Compact. With his vast experience and expertise, Arun is respected as a thought leader. He has written several books and articles with his insights. His recent books are A Billion Fireflies, Critical Conversations Shape a New Post-Pandemic World, and The Solutions Factory, a consultant's problem-solving handbook. Mr. Arun Maira was born on August 15th. Today is his birthday. We extend our best wishes to him. I now turn the proceedings over to Mr. Arun Maira. Our talk will be followed by a Q&A session. Please send your questions through the chat box. Mr. Arun Maira.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahalingam and the trustees of the Nani Palkhivala Foundation and friends. I'm greatly honored to deliver the Nani Palkhivala Memorial Lecture coinciding with the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Nani Palkhivala was a champion of citizens' rights and one of India's most illustrious constitutional lawyers. He won the landmark case of Kesavananda Bharati versus Government of Kerala in the Supreme Court. In this case, a 13-judge bench, the largest ever, ruled that Parliament did not have the unfettered right to amend the Constitution of India. It could amend parts of the Constitution, but it could not alter its basic structure. I had the privilege of working with Nani Palkhivala when I was an officer of the Tata Administrative Service. Mr. Palkhivala was the deputy chairman of the Tata Engineering and Locomotive Company, or TELCO, as it was called then, and was later named Tata Motors. He oversaw legal and financial matters for the company. I was responsible for the company's factories in Pune and was invited to join the board of the company. The year I joined the board, I had a disagreement with Mr. Palkhivala on a matter of human rights. The commercial vehicle industry, in which Telco was the largest producer, had gone into a recession. Sales were low, profits negligible. Unsold vehicles piled up, cash flow was severely crimped. The company could not afford to pay workers their annual bonus, though for them, their annual bonus was a significant part of their income. However, they were persuaded that their fortunes were tied with the companies and that they would have to tighten their belts until better times. I was dismayed to read in the board papers before the meeting that dividends to shareholders would be maintained, even though the bonus to employees was being cut. How could the company not pay bonuses to workers if it would pay dividends to shareholders? It was neither the shareholders nor the workers' fault that the company could not keep up sales in the recession and therefore was in a cash crunch. Why were workers being asked to tighten their belts and not shareholders too? Should not both gain or both suffer? In fact, in my mind, workers need their full wages, including whatever parts of bonus should be considered their wages, to keep their households running more than shareholders might need. When I saw the proposed resolutions in the board papers, I appealed to the chairman, Sumant Mulgaonkar. He asked me to discuss my objections with Nani Palkhivala. I was pretty terrified by the prospect. Palkhivala was already a living legend in India in matters of justice and finance. The next day, I found myself shivering a bit before a very calm Nani Palkhivala. Sumant tells me you think you're taking the wrong decisions, Maira, he said to open the discussion. Explain to me why you think so. I said the company owes more to workers who work for the company every day and all the year than to shareholders, some of whom flit in and out of the company's shares, watching stock market trends. Some shareholders may not even know what products the company produces and probably don't care, I said. So when the company is not doing well, they will take their money out and put it in another one. The workers do not have such options. Our workers depend entirely on our company for their livelihoods. Palkhivala appreciated what I said. He then patiently explained to me why it was important to maintain the dividend in spite of the decline in the company's sales and profit. He gave me a little primer in the structure of financial markets from where the company needed more support in tough times. I do see your point, though, he said. We will be sending a wrong signal to workers whose support we will need for many, many years. Sumant tells me that he's very happy with the way a culture of teamwork is developing in Pune, and we must not harm it. We must find a solution. The dividend was maintained, but happily for me, a special one time allowance was also sanctioned for workers, which was greatly appreciated by them. To commemorate Nani Palkhivala, I will speak today about the conflict between human values and financial valuations, which is hampering India's progress towards its tryst with destiny, where all Indians must have Purna Swaraj, with freedoms from social, political, and economic poverty. What is India's tryst with destiny? Independent India, was born at the midnight hour on 15th August 1947, 75 years ago, when India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, unfurled the country's tricolour flag and announced to Parliament that India had made a tryst with destiny. India had won its independence after a long and remarkably peaceful struggle for freedom led by Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi had a vision of a country not divided into fragments by religious and communal walls. He envisioned a country in which every Indian, whether rich or poor, would hold their head high in dignity. India's tryst with destiny was to provide Purna Swaraj, that is full freedom, to all its citizens, political freedom, economic freedom, and social freedom. The country's democratic constitution granted political freedom to every Indian, man or woman, rich or poor, whatever their religions. It created the world's largest democracy. Sadly, 75 years later, political liberties and freedoms of speech are being curbed in India. Social equality amongst castes has not been achieved. Lower caste citizens continue to live in great indignity. Lower caste poor women live in abject poverty in India's villages. They are amongst the most oppressed humans on the planet. While the numbers of Indian billionaires increased during the COVID pandemic, the majority of Indian citizens suffered from increased economic insecurity. Hundreds of millions of Indians lost their incomes when the country locked down during the pandemic. They struggled to find shelter, food, and even drinking water for their families. Clearly, to meet our tryst with destiny, we have miles to go before we sleep, in the poet Robert Frost's words that Nehru kept on his desk after India's independence. India at 75 is a time to reflect on what is going on in the world around us, what is going on within us, and what changes we must make in our ideas of progress to create a country in which all Indians' minds are without fear, a country in which all Indians, whatever their caste or religion, will hold their heads high by 2047 when India will be 100. The idea of a free democratic India was a beacon of hope for a shattered world in 1947. The so-called enlightened nations of Europe had plunged the world into two horrific world wars within 50 years, into which they had dragged the countries they had colonized, who were the white man's burden, they said they had been enlightening, while enslaving their people and exploiting their lands and natural resources. The First World War was a contest for territorial rights amongst the enlightened Europeans, after which new political forces rose within Europe that challenged ideas of liberalism and free markets, communist movements in Russia, and fascist movements in Italy and Germany. The Second World War was described by the Allies as a defense of liberal democracy against forces of fascism and oppression. The war ended with the US showing off the power of its nuclear technology to exterminate hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the global hot war ended, it morphed into a long Cold War led by the US against communism. The West and the Soviet Union competed to develop weapons of mass destruction. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, another Cold War has begun. The US and China and Russia are racing against each other to develop digital weapons and applying financial and trade weapons to harm each other. The collateral damages of their war are harming the most vulnerable people in the world the most. Sadly, the same leaders who must cooperate to solve global problems are once again dividing the world and arm twisting other countries to take their sides. India finds itself once again in the difficult position of being a bridge between East and West, as it was after its independence in 1947. And once again, it hopes to be a source of a new enlightenment. However, to be a light for the rest, India must first clear up the fogs within itself. This is the historic task India's leaders must accomplish between India at 75 and India at 100. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, political scientist Francis Fukuyama prematurely declared the end of history. He believed that capitalism and democracy, together the Washington Consensus, had finally prevailed over socialism and totalitarianism. History has returned. Ideological conflict between democracy and capitalism itself has not ended. In fact, the two ideologies are conflicting within the Western victors of the old Cold War. Civil society movements are speaking up in the West on behalf of people left behind by the free market of private enterprise. Other voices on the left demand a larger role for governments in providing public services and social security, and others speak for protection of the natural environment. Meanwhile, the right advocates for lower taxes, less regulation, and more freedom for capital to run the world. The fundamental conflict between the core principles of capitalism and democracy, that is, between the rights of owners of capital on one hand and the rights of all humans on the other, continues. It is a conflict between political conservatives and political progressives, between conservatives who want to retain their power to fix the rules of the game from which they have benefited, and progressives who want to change the rules for the benefit of those left behind. Democracy and capitalism are founded on different conceptions of fundamental rights. Capitalism's foundation is property rights. Democracy's is human rights. Capitalist institutions run on the principle that whosoever owns something has the right to use it as he wishes, and also that whosoever owns more of a shared resource must have a greater say in how that resource is used. Therefore, whoever owns more shares in a corporation has a larger vote than those who own fewer shares. On the other hand, ownership of property does not matter while assigning voting rights in democratic institutions. Because in democracy, every living person, whether she has $1 billion of wealth or no dollars at all, has an equal worth in the governance of the collective human enterprise. The clash between capitalism and democracy is a clash of fundamental principles for good governance of society. When appliances designed to run on AC power are plugged into sockets providing DC power, there will be blowout. Similarly, when institutions of governance designed to run on fundamentally different principles are plugged into each other, something will blow up. Fundamental contradictions between the principles of capitalism and democracy are causing violent conflicts amongst nations and within nations. To create an equitable, sustainable, and more harmonious world in the 21st century, institutions of democracy and capitalism both must evolve from the shape in which they have been locked in with the so-called Washington Consensus. Humanity must find new solutions to many societal, economic, and environmental challenges, and in a hurry. They are listed in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals all governments have signed up for. Institutions are vehicles designed by humans to realize their collective aspirations. Institutions of capitalism, as well as institutions of democracy, must be reformed to solve the existential crises of increased inequalities and rapid climate change that are threatening all humanity. I will speak first about capitalism. Nani Palkhivala supported private enterprise for economic growth. He was also a great defender of the democratic rights of citizens. When Indira Gandhi declared an emergency and suspended political freedoms, Palkhivala withdrew from a case in which he was representing her. This caused consternation in Tatas. J.R.D. Tata was naturally concerned about the effect Palkhiwala's uprightness would have on Tata's businesses, but he supported Palkhivala nevertheless. Designs of new forms of capitalist institutions, such as the limited liability company invented in the 17th century, enabled capitalism to expand. With the evolution of institutions of governing international finance and international trade in the 20th century, capitalist corporations have been able to spread across national borders. Capitalist institutions have enabled global and national GDPs to increase and have lifted millions of people out of economic poverty. Economists promoting free markets gained more power within Anglo-Saxon governments from the 1970s onwards. Milton Friedman, who became famous for his dictum that the business of business must be only business, and Frederick Hayek, known for his thesis that more government was the road to serfdom, persuaded Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US to push back against governments in their countries and to privatize public services. Reagan even said that government is not the solution, rather government is the problem. This turn of ideology gave big capital greater power. Democratic governments, as mentioned before, must represent the interests of all people, rich and poor, equally. Though the richest people within any society will always be numerically less than the numbers of poorer people, it is a mathematical distribution, as the Italian economist Wilfred Pareto had pointed out in the 19th century. However, the rich few will acquire greater power in the governance of societies than the poorer many, whenever the principle of property rights dominates over human rights. The shift in the balance between democracy and capitalism towards capitalism in the last 30 years is made vivid by the creation of international tribunals who adjudicate in disputes between foreign investors in countries and the governments of those countries. Governments of countries represent the interests of millions, even billions of people in their countries. On the other side, in the dispute are a few investors of capital. Global institutions, in my view, have begun to pander too much to financial investors, making it easier for them to enter and exit countries whenever they will, while stopping human migrants who are searching for better opportunities across national borders. The rules of globalization have made life much easier for capital than for workers. The word reform has taken on a one-sided connotation. Reform seemed to imply removal of constraints on investors and businesses. This was starkly revealed in India and other countries too during the COVID pandemic. The poor lost incomes and homes while stock markets broke records, making investors even richer. The Indian government's move at that time to reform labor laws to attract more foreign investments, making it easier for employers to fire workers and by curbing unions too, made clear that large investors had more political power than common people. Western ideas of capitalism have prevailed since the end of the Cold War. Mahatma Gandhi was not a fan of the Soviet regime. And when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, he replied tongue-in-cheek, it would be a good idea. According to Gandhi, both systems, the Soviet state system and the Western capitalist system, took power away from people on the ground to people up there, who were remote from the common people. In the Soviet model, power was in the hands of bureaucrats who ran the so-called public enterprises, in which the people were merely workers, doing what they were paid to and told to. In the Western model, the power was in the hands of owners of private enterprises, in which too, the workers must do what they are paid to and told to. In the Soviet model, the surplus created by the people's work moves upward into the state's coffers. In the capitalist model, the profits moved to private owners. In both cases, control of wealth flows from the bottom to the top. No fan of Soviet socialism or communism or Western capitalism, Gandhi advocated new models of enterprise in which the workers, the real wealth creators, would earn wealth for themselves. He advocated reforms of economic institutions whereby producers would not have to pass on all wealth to people above them with the vain hope that it would trickle down to them sometime in the future and somehow. Gandhi understood very well that political freedom with only the right to elect one's own government is an incomplete freedom. All citizens must have economic and social freedoms too, he insisted. They must have access to opportunities to earn more and in a dignified manner, and to accumulate more wealth for themselves. Liberalism is in a crisis. Individual freedom is the core of liberal philosophy. Liberals on both sides, on left and right, say that in the political sphere, all persons must have liberty to stand up, speak up, and form associations to represent their interests. Thus, in the political sphere, they stand united against authoritarian governments who suppress civil liberties. However, where left liberals and right liberals substantially differ are, firstly, regarding the role of the government in the economy. Leftward liberals say the government must play a larger role in the economy. It must ensure social security and public services for all. It must regulate big business enterprises. Rightward liberals want government out of the economy as much as possible. Secondly, they also differ on the protection of the rights of individuals within business institutions. Rightward liberals want flexibility for business and labor practices. They would rather there were minimum labor regulations and no unions. Leftward liberals, on the other hand, insist that it is the government's duty to ensure the safety of workers and their fair treatment by employers. When the Soviet Union collapsed, an advocate for workers' rights in the US observed that the last remaining totalitarian state was the Western capitalist business corporation. Social tendencies towards fascism and crony capitalism strengthen whenever there's a convergence of the interests of capitalists and anti-democratic political forces. History reveals that capitalists have not opposed and have usually supported fascist forces and authoritarian dictators against communist and socialist movements. New governance institutions must be evolved at many levels to solve complex problems besetting humanity in the 21st century. New designs require a restoration of the balance between the principles of capitalism and democracy. Multilateral institutions like the WTO need fundamental reforms to become more democratic in their operations by applying Gandhi's principle of Anantodaya. Trade policymakers must listen much more to the views of the most vulnerable people rather than the views of lobbyists for large corporations. At the national level, local people's voices must be heard by national governments over the voices of large corporations and international experts. On the ground, new forms of social enterprises must be designed that will enable workers and small producers to become wealth creators too. I turn now from the need to reform capitalist institutions to an urgent need to reform democratic institutions at the same time. President Biden declared at the Quad Summit this year that the US and India, the world's largest democracies, must lead the spreading of democracy around the world to contain threats from China's and Russia's authoritarian governments. Sadly, both India and the US need to put their own democracies in order. Pew Research Center surveys and the Global State of Democracy Report 2021 reveal that 2/3 of citizens in democratic countries do not trust their institutions, such as elected assemblies and courts, to represent their will. This includes the US, which is ostensibly leading a global fight for democracy. Several mass killings of school children and civilians in the US in the last 3 months have caused the US president to throw up his hands. The US Senate is divided, and the Supreme Court continues to refer to the Second Amendment of the Constitution to disallow any dilution of a fundamental right of citizens to bear arms. The US Supreme Court has denied women their rights to reproductive health, which they have enjoyed following a landmark judgment of the court 50 years ago. The new conservative court says that liberal judgments of the Supreme Court in the past did not conform with the principles of the US Constitution. In India, too, laws regarding citizenship and sedition, which are based on colonial era concepts, are yet being contested in the courts. The US and India are democracies founded on written constitutions, which state the democratic principles adopted by we, the people, living within the geographical boundaries of our countries. The constitutions define the institutions which are required to maintain democracy, principally elected assemblies and independent courts. The US Supreme Court's judgment denying women's rights to abortion explains some fundamental problems of democratic governance in all constitutional democracies, including India. It points to basic changes necessary in democratic processes in the 21st century. The US Supreme Court's judgment raises fundamental questions about conceptions of human rights. How are concepts of human rights formed? Which institutions have the constitutional rights to enforce them? Justice Alito, who drafted the judgment of the US Supreme Court on abortion, says the fundamental question before the court must be answered in steps systematically. The first step is whether the reference to liberty in the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution protects a particular right. The second, whether the right at issue, in this case, is rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And third, whether it is an essential component of ordered liberty. Conceptions of freedom, liberty, and human rights are not cast in stone. They are always works in progress. All citizens were not granted equal rights in the US Constitution in 1787. Women and colored people obtained these rights later. And people of various genders have begun to be treated equally only in this century. These new rights, not explicitly mentioned in the US Constitution, have emerged from an ongoing civilizational debate peppered with struggles, some peaceful and some violent. Justice Alito explains why courts and elected assemblies find it difficult to determine the will of the people. Abraham Lincoln said in 1864, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing." Written constitutions, which courts must follow, state what the will of the people was at some prior time in history. The will of the people changes as ideas of human rights and liberties evolve. Therefore, good democratic governance requires a robust process for those who govern the people to continuously listen to the people, because people, not courts, shape the norms, the unwritten rules of their societies. Citizens want many things and may not agree about everything. The Arrow impossibility theorem, propounded by the economist Kenneth Arrow, is a fundamental dilemma in social choice theory. The impossibility theorem proves that there is no voting method in which voters, by merely expressing their votes as yes or no, can produce a unanimous outcome, no matter how many rounds of vote there are. The mathematical problem here is that individual voters' preferences cannot be sliced and diced, nor can the choices before them be made too simply as this or that to enable easy voting and counting, as is done in referendums, as was done in Brexit. Human beings' preferences are formed by combinations of many factors in their histories and their present circumstances, also by what they value most, which may not be the same as other citizens. Therefore, their preference for a candidate in an election to represent them cannot reveal their consensus about fundamental needs. Outcomes of elections in first-past-the-post systems make the reading of the tea leaves even harder, when candidates who do not even represent an electoral majority win. Consensus on what we, the people, want, which is the foundation of all democracies, will come about only when people listen to each other. It is imperative for democracy that people like us listen to people not like us. Democracy is a process of ordered liberty. It requires institutions to enable the will of the people to be implemented with checks and balances amongst the institutions. Elected assemblies and independent courts are institutions for governance of the people. Constitutions lay down their powers. Neither must usurp the other's powers. The US Supreme Court now says that the earlier landmark Roe versus Wade judgment, granting abortion rights to women, was unconstitutional because it transgressed the role of elected state assemblies. The Indian Supreme Court is also criticized sometimes that it's transgressing into the role of the elected legislature and even the executive when it is spurred to act by public interest litigations. Institutions are the means with which societies realize their aspiration. Institutions, Nobel laureate Douglas North explained, are not merely constitutionally designed organizations. Social norms are the fundamental drivers of institutions, he said. Constitutions, courts, elections, and assemblies are not all that a democracy needs to function. Genuine democracy is government of the people, by the people. People, not courts, shape the norms. Democracies live outside courts and elected assemblies. People who belong to different political factions, who practice different religions, and who have different histories within the history of their nation must listen to each other and learn to live together democratically. Therefore, what healthy democracies need most of all are ongoing processes of democratic deliberation among citizens. The right to freedom of speech is cited as a fundamental right in a democracy. Therefore, no one, not even the government, should curb the right of anyone else to say what they wish to. Technology was expected to provide solutions by enabling everyone to participate in debates about what matters to all. However, social media has resulted in a cacophony of voices and more divisions. Governments and courts and democracies are now struggling to rein in social media democratically. India's beauty is its diversity. Democracy's essence is the right of diverse people to live as equals. Citizens have rights in democracies, they have responsibilities too. While democracies must give every citizen the right to speak, democratic citizens have responsibilities to listen to others' views too. The design of democratic institutions has so far concentrated on its vertical structures for upward representation and downward governance. To preserve democracy in this century, reforms should focus on designing lateral processes for democratic deliberation amongst citizens, founded on the discipline of listening to people not like us. I will now summarize the two core ideas for institutional reform in two pictures. Can I have the first slide, please? One core idea is that the world must urgently evolve better institutions of both capitalism and democracy founded on a new enlightenment. I hope India will take the lead in developing new ideas and not be dragged further into gloom by the widening darkness within the old European enlightenment. My discussion with Nani Palkhivala 40 years ago about the rights of workers vis-a-vis shareholders of Tata Enterprises set me off on a learning journey in the evolution of institutions, which continues. From the world of business, when I was with Tata's and management consultancy, the scope of my learning widened to the world of national governance, when I was with the Planning Commission of India, and then onto matters of global governance with the United Nations Global Compact and the Global Solutions Initiative. Institutions of both capitalism and democracy must evolve together. The principle of property rights, that possession is 9/10 of the law, which is the power principle of capitalism, has been embedded into systems of governance on all continents for thousands of years. The principle of human rights, that every beating heart has an equal right to freedom, is very recent. In fact, equal rights under the law for all humans have not yet been granted even in all constitutionally democratic countries. The democratic principle of equal human rights must be vigorously applied at all levels of economic institutions to correct the imbalance between capitalist rights and democratic rights. This is the 21st century's agenda for further evolution of institutions. The principle of human rights must apply in redesigning the governance of business institutions. It must also be applied in framing national economic policies, and it must be applied to make international governance institutions more democratic and make the rules of trade, global finance, intellectual property rights more equitable and just. The second slide. The second core idea is that democratic constitutions, whether of nations or of international institutions, must ultimately be the will of we the people, the words with which the constitutions of both the US and India, the world's largest democracies, begin. Institutions incorporated in constitutions, which are elected assemblies and courts, are institutions for governance of the people from above. Genuinely, democratic government is not just government of the people, it is government by the people too. The US Supreme Court has ruled that it cannot overrule the Constitution, only an elected assembly can. The Indian Supreme Court had gone even further in the landmark case that Nani Palkhivala had argued before it to rule that even an elected parliament cannot change the basic structure of the Constitution. Constitutions are expressions of what we, the people, want and the principle by which we will govern ourselves. Even basic concepts like liberty and secularism and socialism continue to evolve. The US Supreme Court, while overturning women's rights to abortion, said the permissibility of abortion and the limitations upon it are to be resolved, like most important questions in our democracies, by citizens trying to persuade one another and then voting. I repeat, the most important questions in our democracy must be resolved by citizens trying to persuade each other and then voting. Democracy begins before the ballot box, and democracy lives outside election cycles and elected assemblies. Democracy comes to life when citizens with different beliefs and different needs listen to each other, and when they understand each other's views and realize others' fears and needs. Okay, let me go off with the slides. Take the slides off. Finally, I end with my poem titled Listen to the World, which is a plea to listen rather than to speak. It's time to press the pause button, put our smartphones on silent, shut out the tweets, trolls, and sound bites, and stop the windmills in our minds. It is time to listen to the whisper in the trees, the caring in our hearts, and most of all, to the voices of people not like us. Then we will learn and find solutions for living together on this earth. Thank you for so patiently listening to my aspirations for the quality of my country by India at 100. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that thought-provoking speech. We have no time for a few questions, and I'm present the questions on behalf of the listeners. Mr. K.G. Rangarajan, who says, seeks your views on the agricultural policy at present and how it can be improved upon in 2030.
Yeah, it's a coincidence that tomorrow and the day after, I will be listening into a Janta Ka Faisla in the India International Center. Our agriculture policies have been made, and it's said that people have been consulted, the states have been consulted, and farmers associations have been consulted. Yet the farmers came out and said, they don't represent our needs. You don't understand what our needs are. And we also have ideas on how our incomes could be justly improved. And of course, there was a core in there to say the government is not listening to them, as well as core in there that, big corporations, when they come in, well, with the principles of capitalism, which are fine, will, overpower the small farmers. So tomorrow in the Janta Ka Faisla, we've got experts, and this is privately done. We've got experts who have been over the last 3-4 years, government people and agricultural experts and some farmers representatives who are going to be presenting their views one after the other to some common farmers who have been selected by them as their jury. And it'll be wonderful to listen to them afterwards, because the format is they have been prepped a bit to understand the jargon that all these experts are going to use. And after listening to them, they'll again have a discussion with their facilitators to understand what they didn't understand, because so often it's all jargon. And then they will give their faisla on the 17th morning, which I'm really waiting to hear. This process of a Janta Ka Faisla, which is allowing people to understand what you're trying to do for them and for them to suggest to you how you might improve it, is actually the core of Gandhiji's local governance principle. And here we are applying it to a sector, but he said everywhere, every village, every part of a town, the people must govern themselves. There are many problems which interact with each other. The problem of water, the problem of earning livelihoods, the problem of the degradation of the soil, the unfair treatment to certain people within the village because of their caste or in cities. All these are parts of a complex problem. And the only people who can understand how these complex problems interact in their practical space are the people themselves. So therefore, they will find the right solutions. So it's not a matter of, idealism to say, let the people govern. It is the only way in which you're going to solve these big global problems that are represented in the SDGs.
Thank you, sir. The second question is solar energy. Your thoughts on it, and how can it be improved by 2035?
Yeah, that's a good thing. In India, I have been for the last, since I came back from the United States and connected again with my friend Maha in 2020, listening to the people of India with other people like him and others, and therefore building pictures of India which represent all perspectives, the scenarios of India. And at that time, energy, of course, still remains one of our biggest problems. And there was, a desire of some technologists, and you know him, Harish, to provide solar lanterns and the benefit of solar technology to people in the villages. And I heard him 2 or 3 years later, and I've been following him and many like him, who said, the problem is not the technology. You don't understand that the technology by itself will not change, cannot change their pattern of living. There's so many other things that need to be considered. So as he said, I have to humbly listen to what are their problems and see if my technology has a solution. Where we jump around the other way, I've got a brilliant technology called you can name the technologies. Artificial intelligence is the new one. And if you apply artificial intelligence, which I'm going to give you, your life is going to be wonderful. No, the artificial intelligence may solve one part of the problem and cause more harm in many other things. So listen to the people, even in, as I'm saying, this is pointed out in the renewable energy. Solar energy, particularly, is a very good one. See, in wind energy, you do need large places and places where you can put up these big windmills. Solar energy, like Harishand is saying, people could put up a little thing in their own house or in their own village, if it has to be a larger scale, to enable more efficiency as well as its maintenance. The governance of that facility has to be the people's governance. So it's not so much, as I say, technology. It's, if I could use the word, the technology of institution design, right? And come back again to the principles of capitalist principles and genuine democratic principles in designing institutions of governance.
Thank you, sir. The next question is on the other great engine for growth, literacy. So what are your thoughts on improving? How do we improve it by 2040?
This is a subject very dear to me. How do children learn a language? Literacy is what? Is that they're able to speak, but we judge it by their ability to write. Then how do we teach them a language, written one? A, B, C, D. And in India, we then teach them some nursery rhymes, which you don't even understand the concepts of the snowman and the snow and etc. So that they can write accurately, but they don't understand what they're writing. So unless a human being, myself and children, are interested in what they are learning, they will not learn it well. So we've got to change the pedagogy from the beginning, and this is being done by many good NGOs in our country. They are allowing the children, encouraging the children to be at the center of learning. And the principal of their local schools in the villages see themselves as systems leaders. They have teachers there and the parents outside and some government functionaries who have some resource or constrain the school from working, all together as a community, but the interest of everybody has to be the learning of the child. The learning of the child. So we must change our paradigm. This whole thing that used to be said the last few years, that government is not efficient in delivering primary education, therefore let it be privatized. Well, if you privatize it, the private sector is very efficient, but it's efficient and therefore it can make money. So you get, the objective comes to make, as you say, a little bit of money at least, but that is how you judge the quality, the character of your enterprise. Whereas in the governance, I'm talking about equity. And equity, as Mahatma Gandhi said, judge it by those people who had the least so far, Anantodaya. Yes. So in education too, we need to change. And there are examples. I would say the Delhi government, as a government, has done very well in its school, proven that. Unlike what Reagan said, the government is a problem. The government can be a solution to basic things. So the time has come in India to treat the public good as something that we all are responsible for. And if the people who presently have the money to fund the building of good public infrastructure in education, public health, do not cough up a bit of the money and continue to resist it on the ground, but you reduce our incentives. Yes, and we are the wealth creators. The world is suffering, and I fear that it is going to suffer much more.
Let me now trouble you with the last question, sir. How will the delimitation exercise, which constitutionally we will have to complete by 2026, how do you think that will affect our democracy? Will it be for the better or will it be for the worse?
I'm well beyond my pay grade as a lawyer. I'm not even a lawyer. So you're going now to the constitutional questions. But I think there's some principles here. Going back to Gandhiji's and Tagore's discussions, where Tagore said nationalism is a bad idea, because then people become chauvinistic and so on. And Gandhiji said, unless people learn to govern themselves and to respect each other wherever they are, the whole world will not be a better world. So there is then, what is the boundary of my village? What is the boundary of the place in which I must govern myself? So we've got boundaries of nations, which are, like we're saying, historically derived, based on culture, traditions, and sometimes, like in our case, unfortunately, by a stroke of the pen, divided a nation into 2 or 3. This is wrong. We are by history shaped, and we have learned to live together in our ways. So there is a democratic tradition of India which precedes constitutions and votes and so on. But the point comes again, that people who are in their locality, so you have to put some bound around that locality. They will, like we said in the 73rd and 74th Amendment, they'll govern themselves. But those people also have to realize that there are some resources like the rivers and the waters and the air and the pollution, which crosses our boundaries. So we have to cooperate with other self-governing states or self-governing nations, and then only we can live together peacefully in this world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It's my pleasant lot now to deliver the vote of thanks. My thanks to you for delivering this thought-provoking lecture, which will ring in our ears for many years to come, and for sharing with us your vision of where India should go and the path that it should tread. Thank you. Thank you again so much, sir. My thanks are also to the DSNL team, Mr. Arun and Edwin, for the technical support, and Mr. Nagaraj for the technical assistance. We thank the press, which have covered this talk quite extensively, the Hindu, Business Line, Indian Express, and others. Last but not the least, of course, our NPAC staff who have made this a success. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us and delivering.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raja. Thank you, Mahal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, friends. Thank you for listening. Thank you.